Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for being here. We're doing a couple of uncharacteristically weird things today. One is, if you've been here week to week, you know our sound system keeps dying, so we have two. That's creating a little bit of an echo, but I hope it's better than having nothing, and that you all appreciate that. So bear with us today. We're trying to get it fixed as quickly as possible. We're a small and mighty group, perhaps because of the traffic. And other things going on, but we're so happy to have each of you here with us today. Thank you for joining us. This is part of the Spring 2016 Friday Forum Lecture Series, Breaking Down Racism, Fighting the Reality of Racial Injustice in the U.S. I invite you all to take a look at the series brochures on the welcome table or at your seat to look at the next 3 lectures. We only have 3 left, so that's exciting. We'd like to thank all of our series co-sponsors for financially supporting the program. You can check them out as well, either online or on those brochures. Sign language interpreters are available for any speaker in our series. As long as we get a few days' notice, you can inquire about those services at our front desk. Friday Forum is rebroadcast on WEP 90.1 Community Radio, Urbana Public Television. We're currently live streaming, so that's cool if you ever can't make it out. And then we also take those live streams and put them on YouTube. So you have a wide array of options if you ever miss a lecture to check that out. After the presentation, we'll begin a question and answer period using a remote microphone. Please wait until we give you the microphone just so that we can make sure we get you on the recordings. If you need to leave at any time during the presentation for class or another reason, please feel free to discreetly slip out. If you are a student who's here for a class or you would like to join our mailing list, please make sure that you sign in on the sign-in sheet. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Eddie Bocanegra is a Chicago native from Little Village and has deep experience in violence prevention and youth development, beginning with his work for the Chicago Project for Violence Prevention, also known as Cure Violence. He is currently executive director of that program for the YMCA of Metro Chicago, and he has pioneered many community-based programs that address trauma and build resiliency among those impacted by violence, including a bereavement group and the program Urban Warriors. Something really cool, last week he was actually at the White House meeting with 3 different cabinet members about the Urban Warriors project. This is a big deal, guys. He also served as a congregational organizer for Community Renewal Society, where he led Force, fighting to overcome records and create equality, a coalition that advocates for increased opportunities for ex-offenders. As I already mentioned, he serves as the executive director for violence prevention at YMCA of Metro Chicago and is a graduate of the University of Chicago School of Social Service. Please join me in welcoming Eddie.
Good morning. So if it gets too echoey, just let me know. I think I could speak pretty loud. At least that's what my wife tells me from time to time. I just want to just simply say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Mike, who's in the back, thank you for the invitation. To not just be here, but to be able to talk about an issue that across our nation, we as a community are continuing to grapple with. And this is whole notion around police, community, young people, this issue around class and racism, which typically it's not necessarily an easy conversation to have. I don't think that many families over dinner have these conversations, and even in academic institutions such as U of I, sometimes these conversations could be quite challenging to some degree, uncomfortable for many. But yet we're in this room, and knowing Mike's background around community organizing, I believe firmly that it is these type of conversations that would allow us to continue to push the envelope forward so that we could see each other as equals, so that we could understand each other's privilege, but also understand the root causes of behavior. One of the things that I enjoy doing the most, and it's perhaps a little bit unorthodox on my end, is that I like sharing stories. I think that what I've learned in terms of the work that I do is that I could talk about research and statistics and data, and often people would write some of these numbers down. But what I've learned through my course of this work that what tends to resonate the most with people are stories. And so some stories might be about resiliency and tenacity, and some stories are about suffering and oppression. And it's really about what do we take away from these vignettes. So I work for the YMCA of Metro Chicago. I manage and oversee our violence prevention program. I work in 9 different communities in the city of Chicago. Just to throw a few names out there that maybe or maybe not you might hear about them in the news. South Chicago, Little Village, Humboldt Park, East Garfield, which by the way, East Garfield is the #1 community in Chicago right now with the most shootings and homicides. And I am entrusted with a small staff, and a small staff that includes interns as well, typically graduate level interns, that allow us to really address the root causes of violence. And in my profession, I work with Ceasefire, which is now known as Cure Violence. I worked as a community organizer, organizing congregations around policy issues. So on one end, I was working on as providing direct services. And for me, it was like, okay, great, I'm making change one individual at a time. And it seemed like it wasn't enough. And so I decided to do community organizing, to work on policies and organizing communities and develop leaders within our communities. And that was amazing too. It taught me a lot. It taught me the idea of empowering our communities. But for whatever reason, at the same time, I was still struggling and grappling that I wasn't seeing change too quickly. And for me, someone who likes to be active, just didn't feel that it was enough. So I got recruited to the YMCA. Luckily, while I was in grad school at USC, and I became the executive director. I was a co-executive director at the time, and then I later on became the sole director. And part of the work that I do is not only provide direct services, but it's really to challenge the narrative of the kids that we work with, the narrative of the communities that I serve in, and the people that I hire. Our foundation in terms of our violence prevention work is grounded in 3 principles, or 3 frameworks of research. One is the ACE study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience by Rob Anda, looking at the impact that trauma has on individuals' life course. We look at Bruce Perry, the neurological brain development of a child, how trauma impacts the brain, and we know now through brain scans, we can actually measure and see that. When somebody experiences trauma, whether it's chronic or vicarious trauma, we're able to see that now and see what it does to the brain, particularly for a child who's still developing their brain. And then we also look at an ecological model by Deborah Gorman-Smith, a professor at U of C, who looks at families and communities and how you need to incorporate the assets in our communities and in our families to address violence in many cases. And I could stand up here and say that at the Y we have this solution, right? The truth is, we have some ideas. We have some ideas that we're testing, we're piloting right now. And even if, while we see that some of them working, and even if at the end of the day we had 100% results, the truth is, we all know in this room that people are very complex. Communities are very complex. Institutions that we work for are very complex. So there is no silver bullet out there. There is no cookie-cutter solution. There is no curriculum that we could just pull out the shelf and say, this is how it works. It's a lot more complex than that. Racism, classism, very complex. I recall when I was in one of my first classes in grad school, I had a professor by the name of Gina Samuels, and it was a class around policy. And one of our assignments was to talk about privilege. I'll be the first to tell you that the University of Chicago has a reputation of being not just a prestigious university, but very often seen as, I'm trying to find the right words, it could be exclusive in some ways. It could often feel as an institution of privilege, which I would say that yes, it is. It's a lot of privilege here. I mean, I get a chance to go to the White House and throw out, UFC, and it's like I got people's attention. But the truth of the matter is that in this particular project or assignment that I had, is that I had to talk about privilege. What's my definition of privilege? And so, as I wrote this paper, I was echoing the sentiments of many of my classmates, who many of them were young, many of them were from outside the city of Chicago, many of them came from what I believed at the moment came from advantaged communities who had a number of social capital, who came from families where there was a lot of privilege. In other words, there was both parents involved, and often their parents, their type of profession were teachers or lawyers. And so at that time, I thought to myself, I feel totally at a disadvantage here. Mainly because I came from immigrant parents. Mainly because my father worked in fixing cars. My mom worked in a factory. My neighbors to my left worked as landscapers. The people that lived upstairs worked in hotels. The people who lived to my right worked in construction. And others worked in restaurants. So that was in many ways my social capital. And so when I came to an institution as a student who came through the CPS, the Chicago public school system, and later on through my junior year, I was expelled from school and ended up going to an alternative school, and then later on joining untraditional programs that where I was able to get my GED. So I totally felt as a disadvantage. And so my paper was really calling out people that I felt came from more of a, for lack of a word, functional homes or communities. And when I got my paper back, I mentioned in this paper again my story, where I grew up at, my parents, my involvement in the streets at a young age as a gang member, and so on. And the feedback that I got back was one that really, not only was it critical, but it was Professor Gina Samuels kind of called me out. And what she called me out on was recognizing my own privileges. See, the truth is, I didn't have to be white. I didn't have to be coming from a very classes family or a blue-collar family. I didn't have to live in communities, some of the Chicago northern suburbs such as Winnetka and Deerfield and Northfield, which are very affluent communities. What she challenged me in was to recognize my own privileges in terms of who my family was, what communities I came from. In other words, to allow myself to look at the assets in my community, to look at the strengths in my own upbringing, and to utilize that to challenge others, to inform others. And that was, for me, an awakening. And so, as of that point, I started seeing good in people. I started to think about, how do I share my privileges with the larger community? Mainly because how can I stand up here and blame police, blame our affluent communities, blame, people who are not necessarily from the inner city communities that I grew up in or that I work in? How can I blame them for their understanding of the other side of the world? And so I'm here today to share just a small glimpse of not only the work that I do, but to be able to provide a voice for individuals who are often silenced. And in doing so, be able to see each other as human beings and also an opportunity to discuss maybe what steps can we take to challenge some of the challenges that we see in our communities today. So, as I mentioned, I'm throughout my presentation, and I'm going to ask Mike in the back to maybe time me because I could go on tangents. So, I'm going to share just a little bit about bridging the divide. And I mentioned just a moment ago in terms of looking at our work in violence prevention from an ecological perspective. So within the Y, we work with different community partners. We work with academic institutions. We work with local nonprofits. We work with churches, schools, police department, believe it or not, probation, parole, and all the other institutions that often our kids kind of encounter, whether it's positively or negatively. So it is becoming increasingly clear that building stronger relationships between youth and police officers is crucial for our city, communities, and families. Distrust breeds danger when you do not trust law enforcement to keep them safe. And when officers who are sworn to serve and protect communities feel they must simultaneously protect themselves from residents. I remember as a kid, there was a lot of domestic violence in my home. And every so often, I would see my father chasing my mom around the kitchen. And as a young adolescent, I would feel hopeless. Right? My father was a big guy, and how often I would look at him as my hero, except for those moments when he would drink. And I'm the oldest of five. And I would see my little brothers running to me. And they would tell me, Eddie, Mom needs help. And so here I am, 9 and 10 years old, trying to defend my mom from my father laying his hands on her. And sometimes I was successful and other times I was not. But often my mom would tell me, call the police. Call the police. And I was hesitant to do so because I knew that if I called the police, they would probably arrest my dad and take him away from me. But very often, I had no other choice but to call the police. So the police would show up. Often they would escort my mom and us, my siblings, out of the house so we could stay over at my aunt's house. Other times they'll escort my dad out of the house. And as I got older, I started having a different encounter with the police. So the thing I hope you guys can take away is that as an adolescent, I looked at the police as a protector, right? While still being conscious of what calling the police, what that meant with my father. When I got about 13 and 14, my encounters with police were very different. In fact, I remember when I was growing up as a kid, even prior to being involved in street gangs, the guys that were much older than I was would ask me, Eddie, can you stand in the corner and watch for police? So I was on the lookout, man, without even really realizing what that really meant. So here I am, dumb little kid, watching for squad cars and then whistling or screaming, hey, here comes the police, while they were stealing somebody's stereo out of the car or while they were conducting some transaction that I obviously had no clue what was going on. And then the guys in the block would pat me on my back and say, good looking out, shorty. Good looking out, little brother. And so what that caused for me was reinforce these kind of negative behaviors. When I was about 15, I remember coming from school. At the time, the school that I was going to didn't realize what gang I was a part of. I would go to school kind of really preppy, and like what you might see today with a lot of teenagers with their hoodies and pants sagging. I try to maintain a low profile because of the school that I was attending, and there was obviously gang members in large part there. But one day I was coming from school, and it was late. I was coming from a baseball game, and there was a unmarked car. And I'll never forget, they were on Longdale and 28th Street, which is a dividing line between two major factions of gangs. And as I was standing there or walking towards my house, this unmarked car drives up next to me and says, hey, what are you doing? And I looked at them like, I'm going home. So they jump out the car, they draw their gun, and they grab me, they threw me on the car, and they asked me, what gang are you from? Now, the truth is, at that time, I was affiliated. But there was no indication by looking at me that you could actually tell that. I was not branded with tattoos. I didn't necessarily have an arrest record. And so they put me in the back of the car, and they asked me where I lived, and I told them. So they assumed, based on my address, that I was affiliated with the Latin Kings. So they drove me to the opposite neighborhood, and they dropped me off. And then there were some guys in the corner. I saw the car drive up to them, and I saw they told them something. Now, what was shared, I don't know. But first of all, I knew that my safety was in question there. And all of a sudden, I saw the guys running towards me, and I was like, shit. So I started running, and in order for me to get back at least to the dividing line between these two gang factions, it was about 10 city blocks. And here I am, with my school bag, running, jumping fences. So imagine what you see in TV with inner city neighborhoods, these houses 2-3 stories high, and you see a 15-year-old kid running through the street, running through gangways, the courtyards of houses, jumping one fence to the next fence, the alley, and then another fence, while this group of guys are running behind me. Luckily, I was in good shape, and I was an athlete, so I got away. And when I got back to the same block that the police had initially picked me up, and I'm thinking, I'm safe. This unmarked car was still there. And they saw me. And they grabbed me again. And they looked at me. And they said, like, wow, you only got a scratch. So they grabbed me, took me 2 blocks down, took me to the alley, and beat the hell out of me. Now, when I came home, I remember feeling the flashlight when I was being hit in my ribs. And I remember so much hate. And I think that hate really came in 2 ways. I think that hate came, first of all, because they were older than I was, and I couldn't fight them. See, as a little guy, if I go up in the street, you gotta learn how to fight. But I couldn't fight them because there was 2 of them, and they were bigger than I was. And I also knew that I couldn't retaliate because they were police officers. And I knew that the gang that I was a part of, and why I joined the gang to begin with, was because the sense of identity and sense of belonging, that they too could not protect me. And I walked into my house, and I remember my dad telling me, what's wrong? And I wanted to tell my dad so badly what just happened. But knowing my dad, he would have picked up a gun and shot an officer. See, my dad was taught to address violence in his life. So there was no question that my dad would have done something extreme. So then when I told my dad, was like, somebody jumped me. Some other guys jumped me as I was coming to school. And when I told him where this happened, then my dad started creating a hatred towards other kids that grew up on the other side of the neighborhood. And so this went on, and this is uncommon, right? For a lot of the kids, as an adolescent, I was growing up, to know and to hear these stories. It's not uncommon to hear these stories from my own kids that I work with right now. The big difference now that my social networks are very different. So one of my kids told me this happened to him. I normally call Loyola University, where they have a great legal department there. And I try to follow up with the parents so they can file charges, file a complaint. That often comes at a price too. Now that's the extreme of things. The other thing that I want to say behind all this is that I've learned, or at least as a social worker, it's about why the police act the way they do towards a lot of our kids. Because I remember that day that it was a Hispanic and a white officer who actually took me in that car. So do I think it was racism? I don't know. I think it's beyond that sometimes. The number of times that I've been arrested or I've been detained by police, sometimes I would say it was provoked. And other times, or majority of the times, it was uncalled for. I think at the end of the day, and I'm hoping to share two stories in a little while, that draws the parallels and the comparison between what children, what kids, what youth, their perception and their experience around police, and why they feel the way they do about them. And on the other end, why police do the things they do, and often what led them to react this way now. And what I've learned at the end of the day, it's about trauma. Most officers that I come encounter today, they, especially the young ones, the ones that just got into the forces, they're psyched up, they're charged up, they want to become community changers, they want to help their communities, and that's why they became officers. And then what I learned through research, and just by talking to officers, that within about the 2 or 3 year mark, that changes. They become burned out. They start distrusting the community. Because imagine this too. You have officers who are typically only called to see the worst in human beings. Officers are called to respond to domestic violence, to respond to shootings, to respond to kidnappings, to respond to child molesting, rapes, burglaries, you name it, the worst. I mean, how often do we call the police and say, hey, listen, we got a cookout over here. We got a neighborhood, cookout. Why don't you come over and get a hot dog, get a burger? Let me call 911 for that. Or whatever the other number might be. How often do we do that? And so I think there's something there as well. I often tell the kids that I work with who don't trust the police, and I tell them, if your sister, who was 16, was kidnapped, would you call the police? And sometimes they grapple with that question. Because in 3 years, a code of silence, right? And sometimes they'll say, I don't know. Other times they'll say, yeah. Very few times do the kids say no. And when they say no, then I push a little further. If your mom was beat up and raped, would you call the police then? If your mom was on the floor and she was seeking for help, would you call the police? So the ambulance can respond. And they pause and they think. And they're like, yes. Point is that even at our worst moments, we call police. And so I think that says something there too as well. It states that there's a need there. There's a need for policing. Now again, these are the questions that we constantly grapple with. How can we become more inclusive? How can we better understand the perception of each other by the experiences that we're facing on the streets, in the work? How can we stop passing judgment? There's actually research that actually shows too that in most confessions or crimes that are solved, it's because police, the way they approach the issues, are one is more inviting, more embracing, more respectful, as opposed to this punitive kind of bad cop and good cop approach. So if research has shown us that, why do we continue to do the other stuff? In 2014, in conjunction with the Chicago Police Department and one of our juvenile court judges, Judge Ian, we created this program called Bridging the Divide. And it's to help build an understanding between youth, law enforcement officials, and other community members. These organizations believe that repairing relationships between youth and police officers is an essential step in creating safe neighborhoods. Bridging the Divide was designed to close the gap by building trust and understanding between two important and often misunderstood groups in our communities. If you think about within your own family, your own friends, your own colleagues, often the disagreements and arguments that we have, very frequently it is because we are misunderstood or misinterpreted. So how do we bring police officers, community residents, and our youth to have these concrete conversations? In Chicago, we've been testing this out in 6 different police districts. These are districts that are in high crime in terms of shootings and burglaries. And that's just to name a couple of things that we look at. And in some districts, we've had some really good success, and in other districts, we're learning there's some challenges there. And so what I'm hoping to share today is this idea about Bridging the Divide. And I'll be short so that we could have some really robust conversations about what we're seeing and how could this be applied in a larger context in our communities. The first thing that we do, or actually, let me just point this out. There are 4 primary goals between Bridging the Divide. The first is to foster positive youth leadership around the issues of community safety. So how do we empower our community? How do we empower youth in these discussions? The second is to create more trauma-informed practitioners in the police force who can respond to youth safety. Now, for clarity, I don't mean that officers should be clinicians themselves, but how can we train our officers to have a better understanding on the brain development of a child, for example? Educating family and community residents on adolescents' brain development, the impact of trauma, and trauma-informed policing strategies. That is extremely important because the more information that we have in terms of why people act the way they do, then we could do course corrections in the approaches that we take around addressing the social ills of our communities. So using creative methods and positive messaging to strengthen local community relationships is the third. And fourth, creating opportunities for and equip beat officers to engage youth within the scopes of regular course of patrol. It's not easy because what I've learned is that most beat officers who are either working in schools or patrolling the neighborhoods, at least in the districts that we're working in, tend to be a little bit open-minded in terms of engaging youth, in terms of pausing for a moment to kind of hear both sides of the story. But then you have the tactical officers who are often trained and deployed in communities to oppress. And by oppress, I don't mean necessarily the people, but if there's an increase of shootings or an increase of drug sales, their job is to go in there and tackle that. Now, for any community resident, they want to feel safe. So it becomes very tricky there, right? It becomes very challenging when we, as a community, are asking police to step in to reduce shootings and drug sales, yet at the same time, we're asking officers not to harass some of the residents, not to take a punitive approach to the work. And I think that right now, it's like, how do we find that medium point? I don't have a real concrete answer for that. But what I could say, in terms of what we're seeing with Bridging the Divide, is that we've been fortunate enough to work with the CAPS, which often work with the community relations of the community. We have been able to train 28 officers to do what we call restorative justice practices, peace circles. So they go for a 1-week training, 8 hours a day, to learn how to use a talking piece, how to engage others, how to share their story, how to allow an opportunity for others to share their story, to find those common ground, those parallels, and to come up with a solution after these conversations. So on one end, it's about training our officers, training officers who are willing, that's the other part, are officers willing to challenge their own biases, their own privileges, to recognize that and to bring that to the forefront of these issues, and to talk about these issues as well, in a way that people will not feel offensive when somebody brings something up, but to be open-minded about these conversations. Also, one thing is to train the officers, but then how do we engage our youth, our young people, our residents? Well, the advantage of working at the YMCA is that often I feel like we're a broker. In Chicago, we have 22 YMCA centers. What does that mean? That means that there's a lot of police officers that are actually members of our centers. So how do we engage them? At the same time, I work with about 420 kids as of last year who are just as involved. Meaning these are kids who are on probation or on parole, who have been arrested, or more importantly, who have experienced high levels of trauma within our communities. Many of them happen to be in gangs. Who would have thought? Gang members encountering trauma. That is true. So it's building a rapport with them, mentoring them, so that you can challenge them as well to come to a room with people that have arrested them, that have arrested in many cases their fathers, their brothers, who've incarcerated them often for an extensive period of time, and asking them to be open-minded to have these conversations about the experience that we have with each other. People ask me all the time, Eddie, what are the root causes of violence? And often I tell myself, shoot, if I had the answer for that, right, like I'll be a millionaire right now, because I'll be able to sell that. The truth is, what I've learned is about relationships. It's about relationships. How do we see each other as people? Now, I don't want to bring my own personal beliefs here. I'm a Christian. And my job is to see Christ in every person that I come across. And if I want people to forgive me for my past mistakes, how can I judge others and not forgive them as well? And it's not easy. It's easier to ask for forgiveness, but it's not easy to forgive sometimes. And it is these type of conversations through a restorative justice practice that allows us to have these conversations, that allows us to agree or disagree, but to find the parallels between our life challenges. One quick example that I'll share is one of our kids. His name is Alex. I've been mentoring Alex for about 6-7 years already. I'm not going to go into his story alone in detail, but I can tell you this. He saw his father stabbed and killed when he was about 13. The following year, he shot somebody, went to prison for 2 years for attempted murder. This is a kid who had many challenges even prior to him witnessing this. When he came out of the juvenile, the DOC, Department of Corrections, he got involved with some programs. There was a lack of follow-up. Even in myself as a mentor, I didn't follow up as much as I could or wanted to. And then slowly, he started falling back again. Overnight, I saw Alex with a tattoo in his face, another tattoo on his forehead, and he was only 15 now. And to me, that was an outcry. He was looking for a place to belong. This was his way of addressing his traumas. And again, I don't want to go into detail. But this is a kid who experienced the worst. Not just that stabbing, but a lot worse than that. Both in prison and prior. And one day, oh, by the way, there was another kid that I was mentoring. His name was Gio Martinez. He was shot and killed about 2 years ago. And doing a prayer vigil, which is very common when we work with all of our kids, we organize prayer vigils so that we can kind of give respect and last goodbyes to these kids. There might have been about 50, 60 people there in the corner. Many of them were gang members. And all of a sudden the police showed up and they start breaking the lighted candles that we had there, these pictures. And there was no opportunity for officers to say, like, hey, just pick it up and take it somewhere. They said they went there, they were trying to suppress from a rioting from occurring. But they went in there without really understanding how these kids were grieving. Went there, broke this visual they had there, and as they were asking people to disperse, some people were, they were making their comments, and some people were walking away. And all of a sudden, 2 officers tackled Alex. They took him to the side of the building, hit him in his mouth while he was in cuffs, knocked his tooth out. I told Alex the following day, let's go press charges. I said, I don't want any problems, man. I'm fighting a case right now. I don't want any problems. I don't want to do anything. As much as I pleaded with him, I had to respect that. Here's the interesting part. We have Alex, who has been featured in many of our programs, and featured in the front page of the Chicago Tribune 2 years ago. He was part of his other program called Urban Warriors that brings together U.S. combat veterans who mentor our kids who are more at risk. And we have these pictures in our building. And as we're training these officers are looking at the pictures, and they ask one of my staff, and I'm just a few steps away, and they're asking my staff, like, hey, you know this kid? And they're like, yeah, his name's Alex, and he comes here. And the officer's like, so he's involved in programs here? And we're like, yes, he is. And they didn't say nothing. And just by coincidence, Alex happens to be walking in. And the officers, they see him, they recognize him, and Alex recognizes them. Alex paused, smiled, greeted them, turned around, and went upstairs to my office. I followed him out to him, Alex, everything okay? And he's like, those were some of the officers that were there when that happened to me last year. And so now, the conversation that took place that I wouldn't have witnessed, but my staff told me afterwards, the officers, when they got together in a circle, discussed that experience. They didn't realize that Alex was really involved in these positive programs. You see, they would see Alex, and they would judge him just based on his appearance, those tattoos in his face. Never realizing what his story was really about, until the staff shared some details about what he had gone through. Since then, these officers have not harassed Alex. In fact, when they see him, they stop, they shake his hand, they commend him for the positive stuff that he's doing. He just recently became a father. But that's the power of bringing people together and understanding why is it that we do what we do. So I want to share these quick stories that we're gonna play on the audio. And I'm just to kind of give you some context. The first story is from an officer named Vanessa Wesley, who is leading through the police department this bridge divide. She, in large part, is single-handedly pushing these efforts. And I remember when I heard the story, it just made me cry. I was driving when I heard the story. And so, we're going to play this, and then I'm going to play a different story afterwards with one of our kids. And afterwards, I just want to have a conversation. I want to talk more about Bridge Divide, what we've seen, what's working, what's not working, but I want you to ask these questions as well. So we can play it. Also, in the front, there's some postcards there on a program called Story Squad, which is the kids who actually recorded and edited these stories. And in the back, there's a SoundCloud link. You're more than welcome to take a card, use it for however you see fit. But they're great stories of our police officers and the kids that have been involved with this program. And then there's another one called Urban Warriors. This is, again, all this is around trauma. But this program, Urban Warriors, which was just featured in the White House recently. It's bringing United States combat vets, post 9/11, with at-risk youth, to talk about these shared experiences around trauma. Believe it or not, our kids, you might have heard the term Chirac. Some kids don't like that term. Other kids are like, yeah, that's us. We do live in war zones. And so I'm neither here or there on that. It's the kids, they're the ones that live it every day. So they're the ones that get the opportunity to talk about what that experience looks like. But I encourage you to listen to the stories because it is about what veterans experience too, and then what kids experience around these parallels between both groups. So we're facing some technical difficulties right now.
We're used to it.
Mm-hmm. Also, as we're trying to figure this out right now, the other thing that I want to note is that while there might be some programs nationally that are trying to address the issues around youth, communities, and police, many of them are led and spearheaded by the police department. And, to their credit, they're making efforts, right? This particular project is actually led by the community. That's one of the uniqueness about this as well. But we wouldn't have the small success that we have right now without police being involved. I think at the end of the day is that you could bring the community, you could bring the youth, you could bring family members together. But if the police is not part of that solution, if they're not in that room, we're not going to go too far.
And we have a spot that we would go to and just draw, listen to you. Music bands.
My name is John Reynolds. I work for the Chicago Police Department. I'm a community. My name is John Reynolds.
As a Hispanic.
My first encounter that shaped me as an officer.
December of last year was a real hard time for me. I felt like my world was spinning. I was telling you with my baby, he's harassing me, and left with a close friend. My best friend from the neighborhood. So I left.
It was my first encounter that shaped me as an officer. I did a job that
It had to be less than 3 years. I was in Roseland, and I was working third watch, and there was a report of him missing. Well, this happens to be a 7-year-old young man. And once the report had been made, they called a plan, I think it was a Plan A, where you had X amount of officers and sergeants to actively look for this missing. So we began to look. We canvassed the area, we talked to the neighbors, we got the description, where the area was like me, our beat us, others. And because we had started on the plan, when I came to work the next day, I was on the same beat car, they continued because they had not found them. It was beginning of the tour, still daylight outside, and first thing they said at the roll call, drive around and start seeing if you talk to some of the people, if they've seen the little boy. By the time it was on the news, Channel 7, put his picture on the page up there, give the description, it was easy. Batman underwear and Batman shoes. Batman gym shoes with the Velcro. And I was walking in the alley on State Street, and there was this garage. And, we kept driving by the garage, and finally we were going in there. And we see the gym shoes. And it was a bunch of junk in there. It was garbage and everything like that. But we saw the gym shoes. And then he looked over in the corner, and he saw the Batman underwear. So we called our sergeant. One sergeant got there, the evidence technician got there, we moved the debris, and there it was. So of course, we had the coroner come out, and I remember I wouldn't look at his face in the garage. I won't remember that. I remember his face that we posted. I think it was his 4th grade picture. And I remember his mom, I remember his dad. He lived with his grandma. And the story went that he was playing in front of the house. It was a hot summer night, and he decided that he was going to walk to State Street. So he walked up to the Bocanegra gas station, and up there was a drug addict, Hyde, who was like on his 5th or 6th hit, and he just lost it, and he knew the little boy. So the little boy was in the gas station because he wanted some popcorn or pop or something. So he said, "Come on, we'll buy it for you." And he started, because he lived on the same block, and he walked in the alley, and he snapped. The pipe snapped, and I think he tried to break the board or something. I forget what he admitted to, but something happened where the boy hit his head and knocked himself out, or was knocked out, and the guy thought he was dead, so he made sure he was dead and did some things to him. But he was the one that was born Channel 7 the night before, talking about I saw him walking that way. And that changed the way I policed. It changed the way that I interviewed. It changed the way that I canvassed. Because when they said the time of death, it was the time that he died, it was the time they had activated the plan. So it's always been for me, what if we had started in the alley? And you have to be careful with what ifs, because things happen and some things you just can't control. And it was a hard thing for me not to say, well, why did I go down the alley? How come I didn't see them? What did it look like, just a man walking with a little boy? What would it look like? So it changed the way I policed. And it changed the way I look at him. Little kids walking down the street by themselves. I'm always inquiring. When I would ride the beat, especially late at night, and if I see a young person, I don't care if they go in the store, I've taken kids home, and it took me a minute, but really had strong conversations with their parents. Like, why is this 7-year-old walking up and down 100 and something in the state, going to the gas station, getting you some cigarettes, and you grown enough to go yourself? So it changed the way I looked at things, the way I policed. It was my first homicide, so it took some small doses to process that, because I couldn't understand. But yeah, you never get used to it, you learn how to deal with it. We process stuff, we go on to the next and we think we're okay. People have strong families, you have close friends, people who can recognize your stress and say, hey, you need to slow down. I can speak for me personally. I believe that the department has every avenue or have avenues to serve us in that space. Because they care about us. They care about how we live. They know what we do. The decision makers have done what we've done. So it depends on the individual. How do you process traumatic stuff outside of this job? We have trauma outside of just being the police. How do you process that?
That was Officer Vanessa, who's been a police officer for over 20 years, and she's actually the lead officer for Prison Divide, but also running the CAPS program. So we're going to play one more. So you heard a little bit about police officer Vanessa's first time, responding to a homicide and her role. And there's a second part to her story, but because of time, we're not going to get to that. We're just going to share one of our other youth, Daniel, who actually has spoken in a panel discussion on a couple, actually, one including the mayor of Chicago as well. So.
Daniel Rios. Well, I do murals, murals, art stuff on the walls. So today I went to one of the owners who owns the restaurant on Millardo 24, because I felt like I messed up the wall and I felt like I had to go back and fix it myself. And I talked to him and he said that, to be honest, he didn't really like it because we were playing around. And I get that, so I offered him, I'll do a free wall. He says, yeah, of course. So me and my friend Fernando, who I had picked up from school across the street from Castellanos, like 5 minutes earlier, we went back to the wall and just by the alley and we started inspecting the wall and seeing what we could put here and what we could put over here. And my guy looks kind of shiesty, right? Like a typical game maker, but he's not a game maker. And right when we were inspecting the wall, saying we're gonna put this here, the